Hello YouTube. It's been a little bit. Sorry for my absence. Took a brief hiatus there. Um, One of my subscribers sent me a message asking me for my opinions on antinatalism. This might be a little rambling. I haven't. Sometimes when I do a video like this, I'll write down bullet points. This time I decided not to do that because I don't know. I've just kind of been thinking about it for the past couple of days, and I don't think I should need to. So, um, specifically, the user asked me about Emendam's arguments. I know he's been kind of the poster boy for antinatalism. I don't know Emendam. I'm not subscribed to him. I haven't really watched any of his videos, so I don't really know what his arguments are. Um, but as far as I understand it, there are about 3 lines of argument that you can get to antinatalism from. Um, Now, it is a position that has existed. It has a history, right? It's not something that someone just pulled out of their ass. Um, I'll say that I'm not an antinatalist. I find myself kind of split between the fact that I don't have a particular interest in having children. Um, I don't know, maybe that'll change someday or something. People tell me, oh, that'll change when you get a little older. I can't see it. Maybe it will. Um, So I don't plan on having kids anytime soon, but I think it's a very big leap for me to say I don't think it's a good idea for me to have kids. To go from there to having children is immoral as such, right? So why would someone say that having children is immoral? Um, you hear that kind of claim, and when I hear that claim and I hear the arguments that go into antinatalism, it strikes me in a very similar way to when I first heard the ontological argument, right? Because the first time you hear the ontological argument, you're like, wait, what? Right? Um, it's this feeling of like, okay, I followed the argument, I got to the conclusion, I think I understand the argument, but like, it, it, it just feels wrong, right? Like, and it's hard to, Bertrand Russell said something once, like, it's much more difficult to, or it's much easier to just dismiss the ontological argument than to point out precisely where it goes wrong, right? And that kind of feeling is the same kind of feeling that I get with antinatalism. That's a butchered Bertrand Russell quote. I'm sure that you can find it. Someone I'm sure will correct me on the comments of what precisely it was. So again, there are about 3 lines of argument that I'm aware of that could lead you to an antinatalist position. They're not mutually exclusive. They can be mutually supportive, if you like. First one, I'm not going to go into that much. I'm just going to mention it. The other 2 are the more common ones. So the first would be Kierkegaardian antinatalism, is what I'd call it. And Kierkegaard, towards the end of his life, he begins advocating on Christian grounds through his Christian philosophical work that the moral position is universal celibacy. And that's what he advocates there, which is, I think, a bit qualitatively different than the antinatalist position that we've encountered on YouTube. It's just not the same, right? And I mean, I won't go into the details. I just wanted to point to it just to give a different kind of touchstone, right? Than might have already been elaborated on in previous rebuttals to the notion of antinatalism. Got to provide something novel. One of the reasons I haven't made a video on antinatalism as such is that I feel like it's very well trodden ground. I feel like I've seen people argue about this back and forth, but I'm not like steeped in the argument, so I'm a little nervous that I will be repeating other people's arguments without knowing it. So I apologize if that happens. But these are just kind of my thoughts. And again, I really don't like repeating other people's arguments. So the second line that you can use to get to antinatalism, and you can do it in sort of two ways, but I would say I would class it as, the bullet point would be the argument from human suffering, right? And there are two ways to do the argument from human suffering. Schopenhauer advances a form of antinatalism on this basis, and it's kind of a proto-existentialist viewpoint. Schopenhauer makes use of Kant, so it's a little bit more in that tradition, right? It's a little bit more in the German idealist tradition, a little bit more of the history of deontological ethics and things like that. The other way to do it would be from a utilitarian perspective. So instead of the Germans, we're talking about the Brits, right? Ethics is an equation. You want to maximize happiness and reduce suffering, right? That's what ethics is about for the utilitarians. From either line of argument, however, right? If you cut the crap, what they both reduce down to is essentially human life entails suffering. Period. Suffering is a normative. It is sort of by definition the thing that we want to reduce. So to bring human beings into the world is to increase sort of quantitatively increase the amount of suffering in the world, which is therefore unethical. So therefore to have children would be unethical, right? And again, I hear this, and it smacks to me in a similar way as the ontological argument. It's like, well, it sounds sound, but it just feels like wrong, and pinpointing exactly where it's wrong is a little tough. But I think there are two ways that I could go about it. The first way, well, I guess I'll say the first way because it can apply to all versions. The second way that I was going to mention is that valuing a quantitative reduction of suffering is I think it's a good value to have, right? It's good to want to reduce suffering in the world, right? I mean, even you could, from a Buddhist standpoint, and indeed Nietzsche referred to Schopenhauer, who is advancing this kind of argument, as a Western Buddhist, right? So you can make links there. It is good to want to reduce suffering in the world. That much I would affirm. But the issue is that that's a negative value, right? It's the rejection of suffering rather than an affirmation of something, right? And what seems to be lacking in this line of the antinatalist formulation is the recognition of affirmation, right? I think that ethics should start from an affirmation. So there are positive values, right? There are things that I value that are positive. So love and honesty and whatever else. Kinship and they're positive things that are valued. And it strikes me that at least there's a larger quantity of things that I value that are positive things than the sort of anti-value of suffering, right? And for me, the affirmation has to be primary. So we reduce the way to reduce suffering is to increase possibilities of love and charity and kindness and whatever. That's the way to reduce suffering. It is through the affirmation of positivity rather than through the rejection of suffering as such. Now, the antinatalist wager, and this is what I would say I'm skeptical about, is that suffering is a much bigger deal than all of those positive values combined, right? So you can imagine scales, right? There's a sort of question, sort of calculus going on here, with suffering on the one side of scales and everything that makes life worth living on the other side of the scales. And I guess really the difference between what my position would be and what the antinatalist position would be is an estimation of how those things balance out. But the fact of the matter is that if the whole human race voluntarily decides to stop having children, then yes, suffering goes away, but also everything that I value in the world goes away as well, right? It seems to me to be perplexing, right, to suggest that that would be the ethical course of action for human life. And so I think it's what this shows, right, is that the problem with antinatalism is a problem with the constellation of values and their interrelations out of which antinatalism proceeds. There's like that value structure is in some way problematic, and in my mind, antinatalism is kind of a reductio ad absurdum of certain particular structures of values, right? So it's a reductio of certain forms of ethics. It's the absurd conclusion, and it's interesting to me that people take it seriously, right? And again, there are philosophers that I like, Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard specifically, that do affirm that. So I don't want to dismiss out of hand or make fun of someone who's an antinatalist or something like that, because I think that case can be articulated with some intellectual weight. It's just that I don't buy it, right? I don't see it, right? The force of the argument isn't there for me, right? So there's a second line, or I guess it's the third line of argument that you could present, and I've seen it before. I think it's more compelling than arguing from suffering. The other thing about suffering is that I always end up having to fall back on that Nietzsche quote, one of my favorite lines in the history of philosophy, where Nietzsche says, he's making fun of the utilitarians, and he says, men don't want to be happy, only an Englishman wants to be happy, right? I always think about that, right? I always think about the question of happiness. It seems to me that, I've said this before in elsewhere, but it's not that we want to be happy, it's more that we want to be happy. I think that human beings are pretty self-destructive, actually. I think that people's actions tend to show, and maybe this is just my own pessimism and cynicism, but I think people's actions tend to show that really there isn't this will to happiness that utilitarian formulations seem to be predicated on, and that at least certain forms of antinatalism seem to be predicated on. So the ethical framework out of which antinatalism arises is already problematic for me. I don't mean to say it's useless, but you can make use of that, but I don't think it's when you use a problematic ethical framework to come to such a radical conclusion as the universe would be better without human beings, right? Then you there's nothing, right? There's nothing like it seems to me to be a rash conclusion. It seems to me to be a very large, extreme leap on shaky grounds, right? Third argument I think is more compelling because it harmonizes more with my ethical leanings. It has been pointed out before that babies don't choose to be born. So I would call this an argument from coercion, right? So when you give birth to a baby, in some sense, you are coercing the baby into existence. You are, as Heidegger says, throwing the baby into the world with no possible sort of with no input, right? And Schopenhauer kind of is again a useful touchstone for thinking through this. He says at one point that the greatest possible good would be to never have been born, right? So Schopenhauer is kind of anti-suicide, but nonetheless would prefer to not be alive. And I sort of understand that position. But that question of thrownness, right? The thrownness of babies, to use the Heideggerian terminology. The question of this as a possible, the act of giving birth as a possible act of coercion, right? Is something that's, I think, really interesting. I think it's a really interesting claim. It sympathizes more with my ethical beliefs because I think that ethics is really about coercion more than it is about suffering. So that's the difference between myself and a lot of, I guess, the rest of the atheist community or whatever you like. And so it sort of strikes me a little bit more firmly, right? It sort of hits me a little bit. It makes me think a little bit more. But I feel like you end up with in this weird space of like ontological questions of like, well, to coerce somebody, right? When you coerce somebody, if I were to coerce somebody into doing something for me, right? That person exists and is on a certain trajectory, and by some kind of force, I move them onto whatever trajectory I want them to be on without their input, right? But that, I feel like every other instance of the use of the word coercion that I've ever heard entails the already existing of the one being coerced. And I know that this has been talked about before by people, but I do feel like I don't know what it means to coerce a non-person, right? I don't know what it means to coerce, like the baby doesn't exist before at the very least the pregnancy, right? Like I don't know what it means. It's not like, it goes from a state of non-existence to a state of existence, and I don't know if I can understand or conceive of the idea of that moment of creation as an act of coercion, simply because all other acts of coercion have this condition of possibility, being that being that is being coerced already exists before the coercion, right? So you begin to enter sort of interesting ontological questions about, what exactly do you mean here, right? I begin to feel like there are linguistic problems. I begin to feel like there are, I don't know, I start to feel a little skeptical, right? So that argument, while it's more interesting, I think it has to be tied to some kind of implicit ontology that I feel like I would be tacitly signing up for by affirming that position, right? And I'm not sure if I agree with that ontology. So That's sort of the the problem that I have there. And again, none of this is really supposed to be a refutation of antinatalist arguments, but more just the reasons why I wouldn't call myself an antinatalist, the reason why I don't, look down my nose at people who have kids or something. So the last argument that I would give, or the last point of concern that I'd give about the antinatalist position is one that can cover any version of it, I think, which is that in as much as antinatalism emerges from some kind of ethical stance, right? It's supposed to be something that you can argue for on the grounds of ethical considerations. So it's supposed to emerge from this discipline of ethics. It's an ethical position. Insofar as that's true, I feel like there's a problem. And I don't want to commit too much to this argument because it's a little bit presuppositional, actually. But one of the conditions of possibility for ethics at all, right, for ethics to be, is the existence of human subjectivity. I think without the existence of human subjectivity, it doesn't mean anything to say anything at all, really, but to say anything about ethics in particular. It doesn't matter, let me put it this way, in the absence of subjectivity as such, right? You might be a believer in God, in which case ethics can be contingent on God's subjectivity or something like that. But there's still subjectivity in the picture. In the absence of a subject, right, I don't know what ethics means anymore. And antinatalism leads to a world in which there is no human subjectivity, right? And it seems to me to be an ethics that it's I said this in a message to a YouTube user. It seems to be like a snake eating its tail, right? It's an ethics that's innately self-destructive. It implodes on itself. If it's realized, it collapses, right? And it ends all possibility of the propagation of the ethical, right? In some sense, it's like saying, the final. You're making a teleological claim, in other words, without I think at least, without recognizing that you're making a teleological claim. There's a direction in this ethics. There's an end that's conceived of, and namely, it's an end. It's a world without humans. And that sort of that idea that and I think in some way all ethics is teleological, right? But when you frame antinatalism in its teleological form, we are trying to get to this point from here, right? There's a path that we can see when we lay things out like this. It doesn't seem to me to continue to make much sense. It seems to undermine itself. I'm not sure if I want to commit too strongly to that argument, but immediately I find myself, for all these reasons, sort of perking up and being skeptical and thinking, well, is people having children the problem, right? Or is the problem a constellation of seemingly innocuous or uncontroversial values, a combination of uncontroversial values like minimizing suffering and anti-coercion, stuff like that. These are uncontroversial, but it's sort of in how they're arranged and how they're arranged to the exclusion of other values. For instance, again, I said before, I might just be repeating myself at this point, but I value love and the antinatalist position results in a world where there's no such thing as love, right? I value right actions, good deeds, and those don't exist in an antinatalist framework. Beauty, right? I don't know. So it seems to me to be a weak position. Um, I don't want to say that it's very possible that all of the objections that I'm bringing up have been brought up and have been rebutted before. Because again, I don't know all that much about the subject, but that's sort of my initial impressions from everything that I've heard or seen from the antinatalist world hitherto. So thank you for listening. 25-minute long video. And if, by the way, if you made it this far, if you want to invite me to a hangout, I've changed jobs recently, and I work nights now, so I can't do like a Friday at 7 p.m. hangout or something, right? I keep getting invitations and keep getting frustrated that I can't participate. But have a good night.